Sarah Dawson had seen injustice before, but this time she refused to look away. On a routine flight, a single moment would test her courage, expose hidden prejudices, and change everything. Would doing the right thing cost her everything? Or would truth and justice prevail in the end? Tell us, where are you watching from today? We'd love to know. Sarah Dawson walked down the narrow aisle of the aircraft, her polished black shoes tapping lightly against the floor. The scent of fresh coffee mixed with the sterile crispness of pressurized air, a smell she had come to associate with movement, with change. She adjusted the cuffs of her uniform, scanning the rows of passengers with the sharp, practiced gaze of someone who had spent years reading people in seconds. Daniel Brooks sat quietly in seat 3A, his fingers resting against his lap, an old habit of restraint. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly against his broad frame, the silk of his tie glinting under the soft cabin lights. His mother always told him that how you carried yourself would dictate how the world saw you. It was a lesson he had taken to heart. The world, however, often saw what it wanted to see. Across the aisle, Jonathan Reed barely settled into 3B before he began shifting, his mouth twisting in irritation, his voice edged with an unearned confidence, sliced through the quiet hum of conversation. "Excuse me," he called out, snapping his fingers at Sarah as if she were a server at his country club. "There's an issue here." Sarah approached with the same measured grace she applied to every interaction. "Is there something I can help you with, sir?" Jonathan gestured toward Daniel, his lip curling. "I don't know what's going on, but there's a smell. It's unbearable. I can't sit next to this." Daniel blinked once, twice. A slow inhale, a lifetime of restraint. He turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Sarah. There was no anger in his expression, only the quiet familiarity of a man who had lived this moment before, just in different settings, with different faces. Sarah stiffened, her fingers curled at her side before she relaxed them again. "Sir, I can assure you there is no odor." Jonathan let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "I'm not imagining things. Just move him." A flicker of something unreadable passed over Daniel's face. He looked past Jonathan, out the window, as if measuring the distance between himself and the sky. Sarah's voice remained firm but calm. "We don't move passengers without cause, and there is no cause." The words were simple, factual, but they carried weight, pressing into the tension like a stone dropped into still water. Around them, nearby passengers shifted, some pretending not to listen, others watching intently. Jonathan's expression darkened. "I want to speak to someone in charge." Sarah held his gaze for a second longer before offering a tight nod. "I'll call my supervisor." She had even been forced to look away. But not today. Not this time. The supervisor arrived, his posture stiff with authority. Senior Flight Attendant Mark Sullivan, a man with salt and pepper hair and an expression of forced patience, nodded toward Jonathan. "What seems to be the issue, sir?" Jonathan pointed aggressively at Daniel. "This man smells awful. I'm just asking for some basic comfort here. Move him." Mark Sullivan sighed, his gaze flickering between Sarah and Daniel, before settling on Jonathan. "Sir, we don't move passengers unless there is a valid reason." Jonathan scoffed. "I'm giving you a valid reason. Do I need to escalate this?" Mark Sullivan hesitated. Sarah saw it, the split second of doubt, of calculation. She could hear the unspoken thought. Was it easier to remove Daniel than to deal with an irate, privileged customer? "Sir," Sarah interjected, her voice steady. "If there were an actual issue, we would address it, but there isn't. Mr. Brooks deserves the same respect as every passenger here." Mark Sullivan's lips pressed into a thin line. "Sarah, no." Daniel finally spoke, his voice even and deep. "Let him finish his performance. I want to see how this plays out." Jonathan's face turned red. "What did you just say to me?" Daniel met his eyes, unwavering. "You want me to move because you think I don't belong here. But the truth is you're uncomfortable with me simply existing in this space." A hush fell over the section. Jonathan opened his mouth, then closed it, suddenly aware of the many eyes on him. Mark Sullivan cleared his throat. "I think it's best we all return to our seats and proceed with the flight." Jonathan huffed but fell silent, slumping back into his chair. Daniel exhaled, his fingers loosening. Sarah offered him the smallest nod before turning to resume her duties. But this wasn't over, not yet. Daniel Laris kept his eyes on the window, watching the world stretch far below. He had been in this position before, countless times. The slow crawl of ignorance, the expectation of compliance. But something about today felt different. The silence around him was charged, a waiting game. Sarah moved past him, her hand steady, her steps precise. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back now. A quiet part of her wondered if she would regret it. But another part, stronger, steadier, knew that some moments in life demand a stand. Mark Sullivan's mind was racing. He had been in this business for over 20 years, and he knew the game well. Appease the wrong passenger, and the backlash could be devastating. But make the wrong call, and it could cost him more than his job. Passengers around them exchanged glances, their eyes flickering between Jonathan and Daniel. Some clearly sided with Sarah, their quiet nods barely perceptible. Others looked away, too accustomed to ignoring the kind of injustice playing out before them. Then, from the back of the first-class cabin, a voice rang out. "I think he deserves an apology." All heads turned. A woman in her 60s, her silver hair tied back neatly, sat upright in her seat. She looked at Jonathan, then Mark Sullivan, then Sarah. "I've been flying for 30 years. Never seen someone thrown under the bus so quickly for speaking the truth." Another passenger, a businessman with a navy suit matching Daniel's, folded his arms. "Isn't right." Jonathan bristled. "Mind your own business." Daniel let out a slow breath, tilting his head slightly. "Seems like my business just got a lot bigger." Mark Sullivan swallowed hard. The tide was shifting, and he knew it. He turned to Sarah. "You're not going anywhere." And just like that, the moment changed. Not entirely, not permanently, but just enough. Daniel smiled, small but real, and Sarah stood a little taller. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway in Los Angeles, but the tension in the cabin remained thick. Daniel Brooks sat still, his hands resting on his lap, watching his passengers retrieve their belongings. Across the aisle, Jonathan Reed avoided his gaze, his fingers gripping the armrest tightly. Sarah Dawson stood by the exit, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She had done the right thing. She knew that. But she also knew that standing up for what was right often came with consequences. The weight of uncertainty sat heavily on her shoulders. As the seatbelt sign turned off, a uniformed airline representative stepped onto the plane, his eyes scanning the first-class section. He walked directly toward Daniel, extending a hand with a respectful nod. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice composed but firm, "we've been expecting you." A murmur rippled through the surrounding passengers. Jonathan's grip on the armrest tightened. He turned his head slowly, his face paling as the realization set in. Daniel stood up, adjusting his suit jacket, and met the man's handshake. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. Jonathan blinked, his jaw slack. You know him," he stammered, looking between Daniel and the airline representative. The representative's expression remained neutral. "Yes, this is Mr. Daniel Brooks, CEO of this airline." A stunned silence followed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The entire first-class section seemed frozen in place, processing the revelation. Jonathan's face turned a deep shade of red, his arrogance crumbling before everyone's eyes. Daniel turned toward Sarah. "I heard about what happened," he said, his tone softer now, "and I want to personally thank you for standing up for what was right." Sarah nodded, still in shock, but a sense of relief began to settle in. "I was just doing my job," she replied. Daniel's eyes held a knowing look. "Not everyone would have done what you did." He turned back to the airline representative. "Ensure that Sarah Dawson is reinstated immediately." The representative nodded. "Of course, sir." Jonathan swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. I didn't know," he started, but Daniel raised a hand, cutting him off. "You didn't need to know who I was," Daniel said. "Respect and decency should not depend on status or wealth. You showed exactly who you are today." Jonathan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The weight of shame and realization pressed down on him as nearby passengers shook their heads. As Daniel and Sarah stepped off the plane, A round of quiet applause broke out. Sarah inhaled deeply, feeling lighter than she had in hours. Justice had been served, not through anger, but through truth. Justice prevailed this time, but how many times does injustice go unnoticed? Sarah stood up for what was right, and in the end, the truth won. But in real life, these moments happen every day. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a similar situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your story. And if you enjoy powerful emotional stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Your voice matters, and together we can make a difference.